Alan Watts discovered that spiritual awakening does not energize, but empties. After studying hundreds of individuals who experienced spiritual breakthroughs, Alan Watts discovered that 70% lost all motivation within a few months, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well in seeing through life solutions. Watts called this the paradox of awakening, the moment when enlightenment becomes emptiness, when clarity becomes confusion, when spiritual success becomes a psychological crisis. You thought awakening would set you ablaze with purpose. Instead, it extinguished every flame that used to propel you forward. Right now, you might be lying in bed wondering why nothing matters anymore, why the goals that once excited you now seem empty, why you cannot summon the energy to care about anything, even though you are more conscious than ever. But Watts discovered something that changes everything. This emptiness is not a spiritual failure. It is a psychological necessity. And there exists a specific process for transforming this void into the deepest source of authentic motivation you have ever experienced. Here is what is at stake. Everything you thought you knew about motivation, purpose, and spiritual growth. You were told that awakening leads to happiness, that consciousness brings clarity, that enlightenment ignites passion. But Alan Watts discovered the opposite is true. The more you awaken, the more you realize that every goal you pursued was an illusion. Every motivation you had was rooted in ego, fear, or social conditioning. Every dream you chased was someone else's definition of success projected onto your life. Watts discovered that spiritual awakening forces you into what he called the blackening, the darkening phase where your old self dies, but your new self has not yet been born. You are trapped in a psychological limbo, too conscious to go back to sleep, but not yet awake enough to know what comes next. The cost of not understanding this process is devastating. Most people think they are experiencing spiritual depression. They believe they have done something wrong, that they have lost their way, that they need to regain motivation. But Alan Watts warned that trying to return to old motivations after awakening is like trying to put a butterfly back into its cocoon. It is not only impossible, it is a betrayal of your own evolution. The real danger is that you will force yourself back to ego-driven goals that no longer fit, or remain paralyzed in this void forever. Neither path leads to an authentic life. Watts discovered there is a third option: learning to consciously navigate the void, understanding why awakening kills motivation, and discovering how to birth entirely new forms of purpose from the ashes of your old self. Let me tell you about the patient who made Alan Watts realize that spiritual awakening can be more psychologically dangerous than sleeping through life entirely. Her name was Maria, and she came to Watts after what she described as the deepest spiritual experience of her existence. Maria had spent years pursuing enlightenment through meditation, spiritual texts, and awareness practices. Then one day, during a particularly deep meditation, she experienced what mystics call ego death, a complete dissolution of her personal identity into universal consciousness. For weeks afterward, Maria felt euphoric. She had touched the divine. She had seen through the illusion of separation. She understood with crystal clarity that everything she had previously worried about was ultimately meaningless. But then something terrible happened. Maria couldn't get out of bed. She stopped eating. She quit her job. She ended relationships. Not out of depression, but from a profound indifference she couldn't explain. "I've seen the truth," she told Watts. "Nothing matters. Goals are illusions. Achievements are ego games. Love is attachment. Work is distraction. I can no longer pretend any of it has meaning." Alan Watts recognized something that most spiritual teachers missed. Maria wasn't experiencing spiritual failure. She was experiencing what alchemists called the nigredo, the necessary phase of death that precedes rebirth. Watts had extensively studied alchemy, understanding it not as primitive chemistry, but as a symbolic map of psychological transformation. The nigredo is the first stage where the prima materia, your old identity, must be completely dissolved before something new can emerge. But here's what Watts discovered that shocked even him. In our modern world, people can trigger the nigredo through spiritual practices without understanding what they're getting into. They awaken to the emptiness of ego-driven life but have no framework for what comes next. Watts called this premature illumination, accessing higher states of consciousness before developing the psychological vessel to integrate them. It's like performing surgery on yourself without understanding anatomy. Maria had managed to see through the illusions that motivate most people, but she had no idea how to function in the world with this knowledge. She was psychologically homeless, too conscious to live unconsciously, but not yet integrated enough to live consciously. Watts spent months with Maria, not trying to restore her old motivations, but helping her understand that her emptiness was actually sacred. She was in the chrysalis phase of human development, the space between caterpillar and butterfly, where everything seems like formless goo. Through their work together, Watts developed what he called the individuation framework, a specific process for navigating the psychological death that spiritual awakening triggers. He realized that the nigredo wasn't a problem to be solved, but a threshold to be consciously crossed. This discovery revolutionized Watts' understanding of psychology and spirituality. He realized that most people seeking awakening have no idea they are volunteering for psychological death and rebirth. They think they're signing up for permanent happiness, not temporary annihilation. But Watts discovered something remarkable. Those who learned to navigate the nigredo consciously emerged with a form of motivation so authentic and powerful that it could move mountains. They discovered purpose that couldn't be shaken by external circumstances because it emerged from the depths of their own being. After working with hundreds of patients experiencing the post-awakening void, Alan Watts made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about human motivation. The very process that kills your ego-driven desires is the same process that gives birth to soul-driven purpose. Watts called this the individuation paradox. You must completely lose yourself before you can authentically find yourself. But this is where most people get stuck. They think losing motivation means they're doing something wrong, when in fact it means they're doing something right. Watts discovered that all human motivation falls into two categories: persona-driven and self-driven. Persona-driven motivation comes from your false self, the mask you wear to gain approval, avoid rejection, and maintain social identity. This includes career ambitions, relationship goals, achievement desires, and status activities. Self-driven motivation comes from your authentic core, the part of you that exists beyond social conditioning and ego needs. This motivation doesn't seek external validation because it emerges from internal alignment. Here's the paradox Watts discovered. Spiritual awakening destroys persona-driven motivation before self-driven motivation emerges. You're left in a gap where the old fuel has disappeared, but the new fuel hasn't yet appeared. Watts found this gap could last anywhere from months to years, depending on how deeply you understand the process and how consciously you navigate it. Most people panic during this phase and try to artificially restart their old motivations, which Watts warned was like trying to reanimate a corpse. But Watts discovered something remarkable about patients who learned to consciously wait in the void. They began to notice subtle impulses that felt completely different from their old motivations. They weren't driven by fear, need, or external pressure. They emerged from what Watts called the soul's calling, authentic impulses from the deepest part of their being. Sarah, one of Watts' patients, described this perfectly. I used to be motivated by anxiety, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. When that motivation died after my awakening, I thought I was broken. But slowly, I began to notice different impulses. I wanted to create, not to impress anyone, but because creating was like breathing. I wanted to help people, not to be seen as good, but because their suffering touched something deep in me. Watts realized that self-driven motivation doesn't feel like traditional motivation. It doesn't push, shove, or demand. It calls, whispers, invites. It feels less like I have to do this and more like I get to do this. It's sustainable because it comes from abundance, not scarcity. But here's what Watts found most fascinating. You cannot force this new motivation to appear. You cannot think your way to authentic purpose. You can only create the psychological conditions for it to emerge naturally. Watts identified 3 specific stages in this transformation: the dissolution, where old motivations die, the coagulation, where new motivations form, and the integration, where soul-driven purpose becomes your primary operating system. The problem is that most spiritual systems and teachings ignore the psychological details of this process. They tell you to follow your bliss without explaining that you first have to consciously compost your old sense of purpose and wait in the fertilizer of uncertainty. Watts spent years developing specific techniques for consciously navigating each stage, transforming spiritual awakening from a psychological crisis to a guided rebirth. Now let me reveal Alan Watts' most powerful insight about the post-awakening void, the understanding that completely transformed how he understood human purpose and why most people never discover their authentic calling. Watts discovered that what most people call purpose is actually a sophisticated ego defense. Your career goals, relationship aspirations, achievement desires. Watts found that 90% of what drives human behavior is unconscious attempts to avoid feeling inadequate, unloved, or insignificant. During his research, Watts documented a disturbing pattern. People spent decades pursuing goals they thought were meaningful, only to achieve them and feel completely empty. This wasn't failure. It was the inevitable outcome of pursuing purposes that never belonged to them in the first place. Watts called this purpose poisoning. When you mistake ego-driven desires for soul-driven vocation, you think you want success, recognition, or achievement, but what you really want is to feel worthy, secure, or loved. The problem is that external accomplishments can never fill internal voids. That's why spiritual awakening kills motivation so effectively. When you see through the illusion of the separate self, you also see through the illusion that external achievements can create internal fulfillment. Every goal you've been pursuing suddenly seems like a sophisticated form of self-deception. Watts worked with a patient named Thomas who perfectly illustrated this dynamic. Thomas had spent 15 years building a successful business, thinking he was motivated by entrepreneurial passion. But after a profound awakening experience, Thomas couldn't muster any interest in his company. "I created this business because I was afraid of being seen as a failure," Thomas told Watts. Every late night, every sacrifice, every strategic decision was motivated by fear of not being enough. Now that I can see this clearly, the whole enterprise seems like an elaborate house of cards built on quicksand. Watts helped Thomas understand that his loss of motivation wasn't a spiritual crisis, it was a spiritual liberation. Thomas was finally free from the unconscious fears that had been driving his life decisions. But Watts discovered something crucial. One cannot simply eliminate false purposes without replacing them with authentic ones. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the psyche abhors meaninglessness. If you don't consciously cultivate authentic purpose, you'll either relapse into ego-driven goals or remain paralyzed in purposelessness. Watts developed what he called the purpose archaeology process, a systematic method for excavating authentic calling from beneath layers of social conditioning and ego programming. The process begins with what Watts called desire discrimination, learning to distinguish between ego desires motivated by fear, lack, or social pressure, and soul desires motivated by love, abundance, or authentic expression. Ego desires always contain hidden because clauses. I want to be successful because then people will respect me. I want to find love because I can't stand being alone. I want to make money because I'm afraid of being poor. Soul desires stand alone without justification. I want to create. I want to help. I want to explore. They need no external validation because they emerge from internal fullness. Watts discovered that most people have never experienced pure soul desires because they've been unconsciously motivated by ego programming since childhood. Spiritual awakening strips away ego programming, revealing the authentic desires that have been buried. But accessing these authentic desires requires what Watts called conscious waiting. Learning to sit without purpose, without panicking, allowing something deeper to naturally emerge. After years of researching post-awakening motivation loss, Alan Watts developed a precise three-stage framework for transforming spiritual emptiness into authentic purpose. Watts called this the psychological resurrection process, a systematic approach for generating new motivation from the ashes of old desires. Stage 1. Conscious dissolution. Watts discovered that most people resist the emptiness that follows awakening, which unnecessarily prolongs their suffering. The first stage involves consciously cooperating with the dissolution process instead of fighting against it. Watts developed a technique called sacred grieving, actively mourning the death of your old motivations rather than trying to resurrect them. This involves writing letters to your past ambitions, acknowledging what they gave you, and consciously releasing them. "I am grieving the part of me that wanted to be famous," one patient wrote. "This desire gave me energy for years, but now I see it was rooted in childhood needs for attention and validation. I honor what this motivation provided while releasing what no longer serves." Watts found that conscious grieving accelerates the dissolution process and prevents the psychological complications that arise when people try to artificially maintain dead motivations. Stage 2. Active imagination. Once you've consciously released old purposes, Watts' second stage involves using active imagination to dialogue with your emerging authentic self. This isn't visualization or positive thinking. It's a specific technique for communicating with unconscious parts of your psyche. Watts instructed patients to sit quietly and ask, "What wants to be born through me?" Then wait for images, words, or feelings to arise spontaneously. The secret is to receive what arises without editing or judging it. Maria, the patient Watts worked with, began receiving images of herself teaching children in nature. At first, she dismissed this as fantasy because she had no teaching experience. But Watts encouraged her to follow the impulse without needing to understand it rationally. Within months, Maria volunteered at environmental education programs, feeling more alive than she had in years. The motivation wasn't driven by career goals or social expectations. It emerged from what Watts called soul recognition. Stage 3. Symbolic living. Watts' final stage involves organizing your life around symbols and synchronicities rather than goals and plans. This doesn't mean becoming impractical. It means allowing a deeper intelligence to guide your choices. Watts called this living symbolically, paying attention to what calls you, what energizes you, what makes you feel aligned. Even when it doesn't make logical sense, you follow fascination instead of obligation, curiosity instead of strategy. Watts found that people who live symbolically often accomplished more than those motivated by traditional drive, because they were working with the full force of their authentic nature rather than fighting against it. The key insight Watts discovered is that authentic motivation doesn't feel like motivation at all. It's like following your natural inclinations, like water flowing downhill. There's effort involved, but it's sustainable effort because it aligns with your deepest nature. Watts cautioned that this process cannot be rushed or forced. The psyche has its own timing for resurrection, and trying to speed it up often creates spiritual bypassing, pretending to be motivated when you're actually still in the dissolution phase. But Watts promised that those who navigate this process consciously emerge with unshakable purpose that cannot be destroyed by external circumstances. because it emerges from the indestructible core of your being. Here's Alan Watts' deepest discovery about post-awakening motivation, the insight that will completely transform how you understand purpose, calling, and authentic living. Watts discovered that the emptiness following spiritual awakening isn't the absence of motivation, it's the presence of motivation so pure and authentic that your ego can't recognize it. Watts called this soul motivation, impulses that emerge from your deepest nature rather than your conditioned desires. But here's what makes this discovery revolutionary. Soul motivation feels completely different from ego motivation. Most people miss it because they're looking for the wrong signs. Ego motivation feels urgent, driven, anxious. It carries a sense of, I have to do this or something bad will happen. It's fueled by fear, scarcity, or external pressure. You feel it in your head as mental pressure and in your body as tension. Soul motivation feels calm, magnetic, inevitable. It carries a sense of, I get to do this because it's who I am. It's fueled by love, abundance, or authentic expression. You feel it in your heart as warmth and in your body as aliveness. Watts worked with a patient named David who perfectly illustrated this distinction. Before his awakening, David was motivated to become a lawyer by anxiety about financial security and parental approval. After awakening, this motivation died completely, leaving him directionless for months. But slowly, David began to notice a different kind of impulse. He felt drawn to spend time in nature, not for any specific purpose, but because it felt like coming home. He began taking long walks, and during these walks, ideas about environmental conservation would arise. It doesn't feel like motivation, David told Watts. It feels like remembering something I've always known but had forgotten. When I work on environmental projects, I'm not trying to accomplish anything, I'm just expressing who I am. Watts realized that David had discovered what he called ontological motivation, motivation that arises from being rather than wanting. Instead of being driven by what he lacked, David was inspired by what he was. This led Watts to a startling conclusion. Most people never experience authentic motivation because they're too busy chasing ego-driven goals to notice soul-driven impulses. The post-awakening emptiness isn't a crisis, it's an opportunity to finally hear the voice of your authentic self. But Watts discovered that soul motivation operates according to completely different principles than ego motivation. Soul motivation is seasonal. It comes in waves and cycles rather than being constantly available. Watts found that trying to force soul motivation leads to spiritual burnout. Soul motivation is collaborative. It works with life circumstances rather than trying to control them. Instead of fighting against resistance, it finds the path of least resistance. Soul motivation is mysterious. Often, you only understand why you were called to something after following the call. Watts encouraged patients to trust the impulse before understanding the purpose. Soul motivation is sustainable because it emerges from your authentic nature. It doesn't deplete your energy, it generates energy. People living from soul motivation often feel energized by their work rather than drained by it. Watts' breakthrough insight was that the transition from ego motivation to soul motivation requires what he called motivational fasting, a period where you consciously refrain from forcing any agenda while learning to feel subtler impulses. That's why the post-awakening void is crucial. It's your psyche's way of making space for authentic impulses to arise. If you fill that space too quickly with new goals and plans, you miss the opportunity to discover what Watts called the life that wants to live through you. Watts discovered that people who learn to live by soul motivation often describe feeling as if their life is being lived through them, rather than them living their life. They become conductors of something larger than their personal desires, while remaining fully engaged with practical reality. The key is learning to trust impulses that feel good in your body, align with your values, and generate energy rather than depleting it. even when they don't make sense to your rational mind. After decades of research on post-awakening transformation, Alan Watts made a final discovery that revolutionized his understanding of human potential. When you learn to live from soul motivation, you don't just regain your motivation. You access a form of purpose so powerful and sustainable that it transforms everything you touch. Watts called this embodied purpose. When your authentic essence finds expression through your human life, it's not about finding your passion or discovering your vocation. It's about becoming a channel for something that wants to emerge through you into the world. Watts observed that people living from soul purpose share specific characteristics that distinguish them from those operating from ego motivation. They work from overflow, not depletion. Rather than striving to achieve goals, they allow their natural enthusiasm to carry them forward. The work energizes them because it aligns with their deepest nature. They respond rather than initiate. Instead of forcing opportunities, they become highly sensitive to what life is offering them. They develop what Watts called synchronistic awareness, the ability to recognize meaningful coincidences as guidance. They serve something larger without losing themselves. Their work benefits others not through self-sacrifice, but through authentic expression. They've learned that serving their own purpose automatically serves the collective. Watts worked with a patient named Elena who perfectly embodied this transformation. Before her awakening, Elena was a successful marketing executive driven by ambition and financial goals. After awakening, she lost all interest in business success and spent 2 years feeling completely unmotivated. But gradually, Elena began to notice impulses to create art, something she hadn't done since childhood. She started painting on weekends with no intention of showing or selling her work. The act of creation itself felt like breathing. Within a year, Elena's paintings began drawing attention. People said her art helped them process pain and trauma. Elena realized her sole purpose wasn't to be a professional artist. It was to create healing through beauty. "I'm not trying to build an art career," Elena told Watts. "I'm just following what wants to emerge through me. The impact happens naturally because I'm expressing something authentic." Watts discovered this is how soul purpose operates. It serves the world through authentic self-expression rather than strategic action. When you're truly aligned with your soul's calling, your very existence becomes a gift to others. But Watts cautioned against romanticizing this process. Living from soul purpose requires tremendous courage because it often takes you away from conventional metrics of success. You may make less money, receive less recognition, or face criticism from people who don't understand your choices. Watts called this the golden ego sacrifice, releasing attachment to external validation in favor of internal alignment. It isn't always easy, but Watts found it's always sustainable because it emerges from the inexhaustible source of your authentic nature. The ultimate goal isn't to find your purpose, but to become so aligned with your authentic self that purpose finds you. When this happens, Watts discovered, motivation becomes effortless because you're no longer swimming against the current of your own nature. You're not trying to motivate yourself to live authentically. You're allowing an authentic life to motivate you. Here's Alan Watts' definitive insight about post-awakening motivation. The emptiness you're feeling isn't the absence of purpose. It's the presence of purpose, so authentic that your ego can't recognize it. Your old motivations had to die because they were preventing you from discovering what Watts called the life that wants to live through you. The void you're in isn't empty. It's pregnant with possibilities that can only emerge when you stop trying to fill it with old patterns. Watts discovered that soul motivation feels nothing like traditional motivation. It's like following your natural inclinations, like water flowing downhill. It's sustainable because it comes from abundance, not scarcity. Awakening didn't kill your motivation, it killed your limitations. Your task is to practice what Watts called conscious waiting. Instead of trying to force new goals or resurrect old ambitions, spend time each day asking, what wants to emerge through me? Then listen without judgment to whatever arises. Remember, Watts discovered that authentic purpose cannot be figured out. It can only be lived into. Trust that your soul knows what it's doing. Even when your mind doesn't understand the process, you aren't broken for losing motivation after awakening. You're being prepared for motivation so authentic and powerful that it will transform not just your life, but everyone your life touches. This understanding lies at the heart of Alan Watts' philosophy of existence. The loss of conventional motivation after spiritual awakening represents not a crisis, but an invitation into a more authentic relationship with life itself. In his lectures and writings, Watts often emphasized that our conventional understanding of motivation is backward. We believe we must constantly push ourselves forward, striving against resistance toward goals that society has validated. But this understanding comes from a fundamental misconception about who we are. Watts would often explain this with his famous metaphor of the universe as a dance. In conventional thinking, we see ourselves as separate entities pushing against the world. But in reality, we are expressions of the universe, movements within the cosmic dance. When we awaken to this truth, our old motivations naturally fall away because they were based on the illusion of separation. The emptiness that follows isn't truly empty, but is rather the spaciousness from which authentic movement can arise. This transitional void can be terrifying precisely because our culture provides no context for it. In traditional societies, initiation ceremonies created a container for this experience. The death of the old self was ritualized, the void was honored, and the emergence of the new self was celebrated by the community. But in our modern world, those undergoing spiritual awakening often do so without maps or guides, experiencing the death of motivation as a personal failure rather than a universal passage. Watts likened this process to the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or non-doing. Not the absence of action, but action that arises spontaneously from one's nature rather than from force or obligation. The paradox is that when we stop striving from ego, we often accomplish more through the effortless action that emerges from our authentic being. Like the skillful artist whose best work seems to flow through them rather than from them. One of Watts' patients described this shift. Before awakening, my life was like pushing a boulder uphill. After the void, it became like rolling downhill with the boulder, guiding it occasionally, but allowing its natural momentum to carry us both. This is the essence of what Watts called the wisdom of insecurity, the willingness to release control and trust the intelligence of life itself working through you. In Eastern traditions that Watts studied extensively, this understanding is embedded in concepts like the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism, or Krishna's guidance to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita about acting without attachment to the fruits of action. These traditions recognize that the highest form of motivation comes not from personal desire, but from allowing oneself to become an instrument of something greater. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond individual psychology. Watts believed that a civilization built on ego motivation inevitably creates destruction, both personal and ecological. The compulsive striving for more money, more status, more resources, stems from the fundamental insecurity of the ego. When enough people awaken to soul motivation, Watts suggested we might create a society that values being over having, relationship over acquisition, and authentic expression over social conformity. This doesn't mean abandoning practical concerns. Indeed, Watts observed that those living from soul motivation often created remarkable external results. But these results were byproducts rather than goals. Like the master archer who hits the target without aiming. They accomplished through alignment what others failed to achieve through effort. Their actions carried a quality of appropriateness that ego-driven action lacks. As Watts would say in his lectures, when you're dancing, you're not trying to get somewhere. The point of the dance is the dance itself. Similarly, a life lived from soul motivation isn't trying to get anywhere. It's expressing itself fully in each moment. And paradoxically, this expression often leads to greater accomplishment than direct striving could achieve. For those currently in the post-awakening void, Watts offered a radical perspective. This emptiness is not a mistake. It is not a detour from your path. It is the path itself. The dissolution of old motivations is not a spiritual emergency, but a spiritual emergence. The darkness is not the absence of light, but the gestation of new vision. What feels like death is actually birth. What seems like loss is actually liberation. Watts encouraged his patients to become curious about the void rather than afraid of it. To ask not, how do I escape this emptiness, but what is this emptiness trying to teach me? To treat the loss of motivation not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be lived. In this open, receptive state, subtle impulses begin to emerge. Not the loud, insistent demands of ego, but the quiet, persistent invitations of soul. One patient described these impulses as like noticing the first sprouts after winter. Small, tender signs of life emerging from what appeared to be barren ground. Watts taught that nurturing these sprouts requires exquisite attention, not the harsh focus of striving, but the gentle nurturing of a gardener. You cannot force a seed to grow, but you can create conditions conducive to growth. This attentiveness to subtle impulses gradually develops into what Watts called soul literacy, the ability to recognize and respond to authentic calling amidst the noise of social conditioning. Like learning a new language, it takes time and practice. The impulses of soul motivation may at first seem random or impractical. They rarely arrive with 5-year plans or clear ROI projections. They often begin as simple attractions toward a book, a person, a place, an activity. Watts encouraged his patients to follow these attractions without needing to understand their purpose. The meaning often revealed itself in retrospect, like a path that only becomes visible after walking it. One of his patients felt inexplicably drawn to study botany, despite having no background in science. Years later, this knowledge became instrumental in conservation work that gave her life profound meaning. But had she demanded to see the entire path before taking the first step, she would never have begun the journey. This approach to life requires radical trust in the intelligence of the universe working through you. Not blind faith, but what Watts called intelligent surrender. The recognition that you are not separate from the universe, but an expression of it. Your deepest desires are not random or arbitrary, but expressions of the universe becoming conscious of itself through your particular form. Watts found that people who navigate the post-awakening void consciously often develop an unusual relationship with time. Rather than constantly projecting into the future or dwelling in the past, they become exquisitely present, not in a passive sense, but in a state of alert receptivity that Watts called timeless participation. They plan when necessary, but hold those plans lightly, remaining responsive to the intelligence of the moment. This receptivity doesn't mean passivity. Soul motivation often manifests as decisive action taken at precisely the right moment. Like the martial artist who moves without thinking, or the jazz musician who improvises without premeditation, there's a quality of spontaneous appropriateness that ego-driven action can never achieve. The action emerges not from mental calculation, but from alignment with the whole. Watts observed that this way of living often brings synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to validate the path. The right book appears at the right time. The needed resource arrives unexpectedly. The perfect opportunity emerges just as you're ready for it. These synchronicities aren't magical thinking, but indications that you're aligned with currents larger than your individual will. But perhaps the most profound aspect of soul motivation is its connection to joy. Not the fleeting happiness that comes from getting what you want, but the steady joy that comes from expressing what you are. Watts noted that people living from soul motivation often radiate a quality of aliveness that's palpable to others. They seem more vibrant, more present, more real. Not because their lives are perfect or easy, but because they're living in alignment with their essence. This doesn't mean the absence of challenge or difficulty. Indeed, following soul motivation often leads straight into life's complexity. But the challenges are met differently, not as obstacles to overcome through force of will, but as invitations to deeper wisdom and growth. The difficulty becomes part of the path rather than a detour from it. Watts found that people living from soul motivation develop a different relationship with suffering. Rather than trying to avoid discomfort at all costs, they develop the capacity to remain present with both pleasure and pain. This doesn't mean seeking suffering, but it does mean recognizing that growth often requires moving through difficult terrain rather than around it. For those who have experienced the death of old motivations and are waiting in the void, Watts offered both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that this experience, though rarely discussed in our achievement-oriented culture, is actually a universal passage on the journey to authentic living. And challenge in the invitation to remain consciously present in the void without grasping for premature resolution. The void is not empty but pregnant. The darkness is not an absence but a presence. The loss of motivation is not failure but preparation. What feels like death is actually the beginning of a more authentic life. This is the paradoxical wisdom at the heart of Alan Watts' understanding of awakening and motivation. The recognition that our deepest fulfillment comes not from getting what we want, but from expressing what we are. In the silence of the post-awakening void, if you listen closely, you might hear what Watts called the sound of your own nature. Not the voice of social expectation or ego ambition, but the authentic expression of your unique being. This voice doesn't shout or demand, it invites and beckons. Following this invitation doesn't require force or strain. It's like a river finding its way to the ocean, not through effort, but through alignment with its own nature. Watts discovered that every human being carries a unique pattern, a distinctive note in the symphony of existence. When you allow this pattern to express itself without interference from social conditioning or ego defenses, you discover motivation that doesn't deplete but nourishes, purpose that doesn't constrict but liberates, action that doesn't strain but flows. This isn't a technique to master, but a truth to embody. Not a goal to achieve, but a reality to live. For those currently navigating the post-awakening void, Watts offered this guidance. Trust the process. Trust that the emptiness is not a mistake, but a gateway. Trust that the death of old motivations is making space for something more authentic to emerge. Trust that your soul knows what it's doing, even when your mind doesn't understand. Trust that the void is not empty, but full of unborn possibilities waiting for the right conditions to emerge. This trust isn't blind faith, but intelligent surrender to the wisdom of life itself working through you. It's the recognition that you are not separate from the universe, but a unique expression of it. Your task isn't to force the process, but to allow it. Not to fill the void, but to become spacious enough to receive what wants to emerge through you. Alan Watts discovered that this process cannot be rushed or forced. It has its own timing, its own wisdom, but it can be trusted. The darkness always gives way to dawn. The void always gives birth to form. Death always leads to rebirth. This is the eternal cycle, not just of nature, but of consciousness itself. The paradox of awakening isn't a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Those who navigate this mystery consciously discover motivation so authentic that it transforms not just their individual lives, but ripples outward to touch everyone they encounter. Not through preaching or proselytizing, but through the contagious quality of authentic living. As Watts often said, the only Zen you find on the tops of mountains is the Zen you bring up there. Similarly, the only purpose you find in life is the purpose you embody. The post-awakening void is an invitation to discover this embodied purpose. Not by seeking it, but by becoming it. Not by doing more, but by being more fully who you already are. This is the essence of Alan Watts' teaching on motivation and awakening. The recognition that true purpose isn't something you find, but something you remember. Not something you achieve, but something you express. Not something you create, but something you allow. In this allowing, you discover motivation that doesn't deplete, but nourishes. Purpose that doesn't confine, but liberates. Action that doesn't strain, but flows. This isn't spiritual theory, but practical wisdom for living. Not an escape from life's challenges, but a more authentic way of meeting them. Not denial of the world, but deeper participation in it. Alan Watts' insights on post-awakening motivation offer a radical alternative to our culture's achievement-oriented paradigm. Instead of pushing harder against resistance, align with the currents of your own nature. Instead of forcing outcomes through sheer will, allow them to emerge through authentic expression. Instead of chasing external validation, discover